Well, welcome everyone. I'm Danielle Ofri, the chief editor of Bellevue Literary Review. If you don't know BLR, this is our 50th issue, number 50. And this year we're celebrating our 25th anniversary. And BLR publishes fiction, poetry, nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. And we're so excited to have our inaugural book club. And I want to introduce my co-editor, Doris W. Cheng.
Thanks, Danielle. And also wanted to thank everyone who was a part of the inaugural BLR Book Club. And thank you for reading with us over the past 7 weeks as we immersed ourselves in the world of this novel. So just a little bit about the book before we start, for those of you who haven't had a chance to get to the novel. Fire Exit is about Charles Lamasway, a white man who lives across the river from the Native American reservation where he was raised and where he has watched his secret daughter grow up. Charles is now caring for his mother with dementia, and he wants to tell his daughter the truth about her parentage. And Morgan, would you like to start us off by reading a little bit from your book?
Yeah, thank you so much for the having me, and I'm very excited to be here. Welcome, everybody. Uh, so I'd like to read, so I would sit in for a long haul here. It's very lengthy from the opening. I'm kidding, it's just the first sentence, but I'm not going to do that. It'll be more. I want to just read the opening. Doris, you explained the book very well, and I think the opening does a good job of kind of talking more about it thematically. Can you hear me okay? Okay, my internet. I wanted to make sure that wasn't a problem. I wanted the girl to know the truth. I wanted her to know who I was, who I really was, instead of a white man who had lived across from her all her life and watched her grow up from this side of the river. It was late spring. I sat outside drinking coffee and not smoking because my lighter had run out of gas. Fog rolled off the water that divided the Penobscot Nation from the rest of the state of Maine. I was waiting, as I usually did. Soon, across the river and on the reservation, my girl, a woman by that point, came out of the house and got in her car to go to work. I didn't know how many times I'd been through the same routine, but that morning something took hold of me. Something was different this time. She started her car and backed out of the driveway, and then, as usual, she was out of sight. I got up and drank the rest of my coffee and thought about calling Louise, my mother, but decided she was probably sleeping. So I went inside to make breakfast. Not because I was hungry, but because I needed something to do so I could think about what had come over me. Maybe the change had come about because I'd stopped working in the woods so much and had more time to think. But the fact was that I'd gone along for too long with Mary's plan to lie and say that the girl was another man's, an enrolled native man's, so that she, our daughter, could be on the census. Mary's Penobscot blood plus Roger's, giving Elizabeth exactly what she needed to be enrolled. But that morning I wanted our daughter to know the truth. I was tired of holding that secret. I was going to make eggs and some seasoned hash and think about all this, but when I cut up the washed potato, I nicked the tip of my thumb real good with a knife and got blood all over my hand and said, "Forget it." I went to the couch and sat down, and I wrapped a paper towel around my thumb and watched the blood seep through, and then there was no denying what I wanted. I did want the truth to be known. The blood that came out of me was the blood that ran through her veins. It's strange. All blood looks the same, yet it's different, we're told, in so many various ways and for so many various reasons. But one thing is for certain, I thought. You are who you are, even if you don't know it.
Wow, I love that last line. You are who you are, even if you don't know it. And I think that's, one of the things we want to talk about in addition to the book. We love to talk at BLR about the craft of writing and, a killer opening to a book. And, a book not only has to be good, but it has to make you turn the page, right? And that certainly makes you turn the page. In fact, when Stacy and we first got our copies of the book, we wanted to take some pictures. So we just opened the book just for a picture, but then started reading and, and couldn't stop. I have
And
a
then you
lot of
forgot to take the
questions.
picture.
Uh, but I wanted to start out with why you chose the narrator as an outsider, right? You could have chosen a narrator from inside the reservation, but you chose an outsider. So what drove you to make the choice? And did that make it harder to tell the story?
Actually, I think it was the only way I could tell the story. was to have this individual be an outsider. I mean, an insider at first, to a degree, right? But an outsider ultimately. Um, but I'll answer this not so much as like I chose it, more of my compulsive writing that I do when I work on anything. So like this published version is so I wrote five prior like actual full books, before I got to this one. And so like one was like a multiple perspective novel that was told like, we saw Roger's point. Actually when the book came out, I had forgot like I thought like I it was envisioning scenes that weren't actually in the book, because I'd written so many. And but like I had a multiple perspective novel where it was like Mary, Roger, and alternated with close third person. I tried all these different ways. Um, I think of parallax, that like astrological term, but I think it's a literary term. It's like how you view like where something is, like your vantage point of it changes. Like so like I was with my students, I'm like, I can see the front of my computer screen and you can't tell me what's there. And you can see the back of my computer and you can tell me what's there, but I can't see it, right? So it's like that's where like those multiple perspectives I feel like are useful, right? In seeing something. But I finally got to the point I was like trying everything to avoid him as the narrator for some reason. But then I started to write into him and I was like, well, wait a minute. I was like, he is in a way like able to achieve a sense of parallax, even if, he's not aware of it because he's been both an insider and an outsider. And so I was like, maybe this can work. And so I stuck with him. And then I found Bobby and I was like, all right, well, I can't leave Bobby. Bobby's too funny of a character, and I just kept going. And really the story, my belief is that, story, like I'm writing, but I'm like sharing space with something there. It's not a gut feeling, but it's like, I don't know. I don't know how to describe it. It's my only religion, I suppose. But that's really what led me to it was craft, was thinking about craft and like trying over and over again and hoping that the sixth version would be the one that would end it.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that because I think, as all of us as writers, and we try to teach writing, help others, find their story, it often is many tries to find what is the angle into the story. And I think many writers will have a similar story of having rewritten a piece. I know I have torn things up, pasted them back together. And sometimes you just have to find the right way in or where the frame is, even though the content is the same. It's the how we tell it. And I'll pass it to you, Doris.
I agree. I think finding the right narrative voice is like it's one of the biggest questions when you start for me when I start a project and just when you find the voice it feels like everything just kind of locks in and it just goes from there. Um, but I wanted to ask you one of the things that I found really fascinating was the way your characters' lives have been shaped by the history of this country. So there's the reservation system, there's the Indian Settlement Act, and then there's this idea of blood quantum, which, I mean, these are all things that have determined the course of Charles's life and his family's life, and also their mental and physical health. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, about this concept of blood quantum and what kind of research you had to do versus things that you could draw from your own lived experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Blood quantum, I'll try to do it as simply as possible. There's actually a book. This is the great thing about this is, where is it? Uh, a really good book that came out at the time I was like doing edits on this. It's called The Indian Card, Who Gets to Be Native in America by Carrie Lowry. In the record, I think it might be backwards, but it is a great book. If people want to read it. I also, for folks who want a deeper dive into blood quantum, I did write a piece for Esquire. If folks want to read that, I hate to say it, but it's paywalled. Although David Sedaris's like turd story isn't. I don't understand that, but blood quantum, um, uh, it's hard to say its originations or like where it originated from, but uh, in the I believe colony is it the colony of Virginia, the one that went crazy? No, yeah, yeah, colony of Virginia. Is that where the coffee was founded? I believe, right? Or like, Yeah, it was 1705. Let's set the scene. 1705. Blood Quantum actually came out. It was, another side of a coin, and it came out of a discussion concerning African Americans and um, basically how white men can continue to rape black women, and if there's a male, right, that male, is an heir. How do they make that, for land, all that stuff. So they made it so if there's like one drop rule, you're you're African American. It didn't matter, right? And they then applied that to indigenous people, but it became a two drop rule. So it was like two people removed. So if you married out twice, your children weren't native, and it spread and found its way somehow into uh, like the federal government's conversations about like how do we keep track of indigenous people? So census. So every federally recognized tribe has a census that goes all the way back to as long as like you need it to prove that you're a federally recognized tribe. And so um, blood quantum is essentially like I'm only 25% Penobscot, right? You can see it in me, right? Um, so I'm only 25%. My mom was 50%, and my grandmother was 100%. Um, now, not all tribes use blood quantum. It's not required by the federal government. So, like some tribes use like patrilineal, matrilineal, different systems, but blood quantum is like the main one that's used. And um, so like my son, whose name is Charlie, literally there's no connection at all between Charles and here. Like he's not an enrolled citizen yet. I speak Penobscot to him, like and all those things. So for me, I don't believe in it, but even though it's there, like, but this is the fascinating thing is that tribes can make well, they can lower and raise blood quantum. So like tribes have to keep track of like their population, and if they find it dropping, like we have the legal right to be like, oh, okay, everybody. So I could be 80, and then all of a sudden I get something in the mail that's being like, you're now 100%, to maintain, like a healthy number of people. But if you do it like at a time where it's like you have a healthy population of people and you think about funds and resources, we don't know how many descendants are out there. So they become quarter bloods, and then there could be 25,000 people that come in. And it's like, what do you do? Right? But people don't understand that we can structure it all legally. Um, I'll bore you with the legal court case really quickly, but Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez in 1978, wherein a woman, this is patrilineal, she was Pueblo, but she had children with a man who was native but not Pueblo. Her children couldn't be enrolled. And so she said that violated the Indian Civil Rights Act and all this stuff. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it's entirely up to the tribes to determine how they choose eligibility. And unless Congress says otherwise, and they've not said otherwise, they would if it became a problem for the US. But like, so we have the right to shape it however we want. I know the book doesn't talk about that, but blood quantum is literally a fabricated thing to keep us constantly reminded of the fact that we're both here and not here, and that our blood matters and it doesn't matter, that our skin color matters and it doesn't matter in this limbo state. And it's almost like I can't help but think of this word that I think is really strongly related, and it, like somatic memory in a way. It's like it's become a somatic memory. It's become this intergenerational trauma we all inherit, I think.
That is so fascinating. It's so bureaucratic in some sense. And so when you say you know who you are, even if you don't know it, and the fact that the rules can change. I mean, it's such a fascinating thing in American history. Like which immigrants were dark when they came, but two generations later they're considered white because they've been living here long enough, but they were the same people. And we redefine, there's a randomness to it. How do you, and I'll take this into the writing, but when there is that somewhat randomness, how do you jive that with the identity that might be more deeper felt. That tension seems quite potent.
I'm trying to think because that's such a hard, yeah, quite. Can you ask it again? I'm just fascinated by it
Yeah,
because it's like a really
because
important
there's a
one.
sense of the book is about identity and how deeply held it is for people. On the one hand, yet on the other hand, the stroke of a pen can change it. Okay, one drop, two drops, six drops, 80%, 20% can randomly change it by this bureaucratic means. How do people navigate that tension? And I guess in your characters, I mean, the narrator, he feels very native. He grew up on the reservation. He speaks the language, the music, and yet he's being told that he's actually not, even though he feels much more in tuned with the culture than people who may have left but are 100% or 10 drops, whatever the drop is. It's just a fascinating tension. I'm just wondering what you think about that and how you might write about that.
It's very hard to write about, and to be frank, like like I read like in rereading this book, like there's things I'm like I don't really agree with this idea. Like it's fascinating. You know what I mean? Like because he's a character in and of himself, and like I embody what he thinks and what I think he thinks, and I'll share one detail that I think might have helped me. Is that like I grew up on the reservation, but in the summers I spent with my father in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And when I would leave when you're on the res in Maine, at least, because it's an island, like you're native, like you feel it, because everybody's native, who's who, and then who's not like part, like you're like, who's that random white person taking photos of us, which used to happen when we were kids. Very strange. Like, um, but in Connecticut, like I would get quite tan, and I also speak Spanish. Long story. And so like people thought I was just like maybe Puerto Rican, or just like a white person. And so I was able to pass as something different. And when I would tell people I was native, it was met with like, well, you must have a lot of money or something because natives supposedly have casinos left and right. But the point is like I had lived that Charles kind of experience where I was him in a way, where I was indigenous, but I was no longer, even though technically I was, but I was in a place that didn't see it like that. Um, Today, though, I don't have that feeling anymore. Like wherever I am, I'm just like, I'm indigenous. Like that's not how I feel. I've learned to embed that into my soul, and my heart. And how I look at my son, I'm like, when you're native, I don't care what the rules say, like, but it is such a complicated thing. And it's like, how do people deal with it? That's you know, we see with Elizabeth, because Elizabeth's, health is tied to the fact that she doesn't know these stories, but also to the fact, I think, of this very topic that we're talking about, right? Of like, of this tension, you know. Yeah, I could go on and on about it, but it's like the core of what is making her and others unhealthy. And it has a lot to do with the world needing to redefine what belonging means and, grace and care and acceptance as well. These past few years haven't been the best to get that done, but I still stand behind writing and doing the work, even in those moments, because it's things I care about. And I,
Yeah.
just as an aside, went to school with kids who were not native, who were like Charles, had married in and had to leave when they were like 18. And I wonder to this day, like they got better grades than I did in language art and like Penobscot language, like they were better singers than me, and drumming. And like they had to leave when they were 18 or, maybe 19 and they haven't returned. And I'm like, I wonder how they feel. Like, I'm like, I wonder what they think they are. Like, what have they adopted, you know? Um, so yeah. They're out there, a lot of them, and not just
Yeah.
indigenous folks, but other. Yeah,
Right. I mean, I think what Danielle was getting at was just there's such this tension between the way that, people identify as them, how they see their own identity versus the way the outside world or the state, tries to define their identity. And they don't line up because because your identity is based on a lot of other things, who you love and the stories that you learn, your language. And just speaking of stories, I mean that was a very big part of this book was the idea of storytelling as being a really important part of having a healthy understanding of ourselves. Um, there's a great line where you say, "We are made of stories, and if we don't know them, the ones that make us, how can we ever be fully realized? How can we ever be who we really are?" So I wonder if you want to elaborate on that and talk about just the importance of storytelling in terms of healing from trauma and connecting within a community.
Yeah, that's funny. That was the other passage I was actually going to read.
I think
I
that's at
think
the
it's
very end, as opposed
yeah,
to the very
page
beginning.
226. I have it pulled up. Yeah, yeah. That I see it actually all the time now. My wife and I have been watched or tried. We started to watch like Malcolm in the Middle came out with like a new like 4 episode like years later thing, and um, the premise is that like Malcolm gets away because he's been the genius of this dysfunctional family. He has a daughter. He's lied. They don't know she exists, and she says something along the lines of like I've had this whole family that I didn't know about. She's like, "Do you have any idea how that like could have affected me?" Like, and she meant both without knowing and knowing at the same time because she's a genius in the same way that Malcolm is. And um, this it's so hard because like I agree with some of like the subtopics of this. Like we're made of stories if we don't know them, the ones that make us. How can we ever be fully realized? How can we ever be who we really are? And I think there's two ways to talk about it. One is the political, right? And I think the right to know and the right to live that story, right? Um, but then there's also the personal, right? The choice that you can the choice, or how do I say that? The option to choose whether or not you accept a new story, something unknown, but that is part of your body and secretly hidden from you. And I turned to two like real life examples. Uh, a peer who was a mentee of mine when I taught at Institute of American Indian Arts. This writer uh, came from Chile, and she was during the time when they were taking Chilean children and Americans were adopting them. And she was very dark. She grew up in a very white family in Connecticut. She taught herself Spanish. And like years later, I mean, she's 35, she's my age. She went back to Chile and she found her mom and she like reconnected, right? And so she chose to like find out this story, right? And to live it. And then, I have a relative of mine who, I'll just, a relative of mine who was adopted. And several years ago, we found her sisters on Facebook. And this individual didn't want to communicate with them. Like she had lived her life and like she knew what her life was. She had come to terms with things. And then, actually not too long, a couple months ago, they did connect, but not by her choosing. And introduced to her new things such as the fact that she didn't never knew this, but that her mother had given her up for adoption because her husband had left her and she couldn't care for her, but she spent the rest of her life looking for her daughter. She didn't, want to know. I don't think she wanted to know these things, right? So she had made a choice. You'd be like, I want to live the life that I built with my children and my husband, and like that's it. But then it seeped in not by her choosing. And I haven't talked to her about this, but I wonder how that affects her, how that makes her feel. And so I hope this is answering your question, but it's almost like I agree with like, like I almost am like, I don't agree with this anymore. It's like to a degree, politically, I agree with it. Like we should have the right to know who we are and embrace it, but we should also be conscious of the choices we make in choosing to accept those stories because that's self-care, right? Like that is
Right.
care. Like that's an important thing. And
It's almost
oh,
like having the choice. It should be your choice whether it becomes your story or not, rather than having it imposed on you.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like colonialism is great at this. You know, it's like I grew up on the reservation in history class reading books. You know, history books were in the section on Indians was how they were savages, you know, and it's like that's me, you know, you know, it's like it's very good at telling your story for you, right? And it's not, you know, to crib from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's, talk on like the danger of the single story. Like there always needs to be two narratives, but tension doesn't always need to be bad. You know what I mean? Like there can be a good tension with some underlying, maybe like, I don't know, frustration, but like something has to give. I don't know.
Yeah, just for those who aren't aware, the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's talk is it's a TED talk, which you can find online. It's called The Danger of a Single Story, and it's great. It's about the importance of having a multiplicity of stories rather than a single story about, a group of people or anyone. Just before we forget, if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat um, so we can get to them at the end.
It's interesting. We talk about the multiplicity of stories. It kind of, to me, goes back to our initial conversation about the point of view of a book or a story that we choose, and that you may have many points of view that all have some amounts of validity because they exist for that person's view, and whether the view might be the state or the colonizer or the adoptee or the warrior, however many, and some of those are chosen and some are put upon us, but they all have, maybe legitimacy is the wrong word, but they have some grains of reality, and understanding them is complicated. But of course, it also makes for, as said in lectures, more interesting than just a plain old narrative. And of course, for reading and great literature, it's always more interesting when we have these multiple perspectives and even the awful ones have grains that are relevant, that we must grapple with. And I want to switch the conversation a little bit. At BLR, we write on issues of health, illness, and healing. And certainly pain is something that comes up a lot in the poems we publish, the stories. And writing about pain is not easy. It's kind of like writing about sex. It is very hard to do well and easy to sound like a parody. And, often when I'm reading through the slush pile, I'm thinking, what is or is not working about how this writer is trying to portray pain. I was just looking at a poem before we started and thinking about this particular portrayal of pain. And obviously, there's all kinds of pains and levels of suffering. Your book mines many of them. And I'm curious, for yourself, how do you navigate writing these moments of pain, but without letting the narrative become defined solely by suffering, which might be just too hard to read?
Yeah, yeah. No, I spent a long time in my formative years. I don't know, gas Nick Carraway or something like that. But you know, practicing that because when I first started writing, like I was writing like romanticized bull crap, like native stories, like like blank Alexi individual type line things, and I had a mentor who was fortunate enough to be like, cut that crap out, these like this is misery porn, like and that stuff sells, it does unfortunately, but like you don't want to do that. And like I began to see it. And for me, like lately I turned to Jane Austen's Persuasion, I think it is. There's a line in there where she says, I hate that she said this because it opens up a weird conversation, but I also am like glad she wrote it. It's like one does not love a place the less for having suffered in it, unless it's been all suffering, nothing but suffering. And so I've always seen that as like a graph of like, oh, okay, like, but then it becomes like measure suffering, like why have more suffering than you in a way? And it's like, I don't think that's true. Like I think like for me as a writer, the most important thing is emotion because it's like, and this is how I get away from the pain, is it's like everybody knows what it's like to experience an emotion. The degree to which that they understand it or have felt it may be different, but the fact that they can feel that emotion, unless they actually have a clinical issue in which they can't feel emotions, but generally speaking, like we know what happiness feels like, sadness, we know what physical pain, mental pain, can feel like. And sure, not everybody, has the full spectrum of experience, but we have empathy. And so when I write, I try to get to emotion because that's the only thing that I think when we strip away our identities, our skeleton, everything like beyond the cellular level, it's like emotion is what exists. It's the one thing that binds us and transcends any sort of like boundary, visible or invisible. Because like how many of you have donated after hearing In the Arms of the Angels by Sarah McLachlan put to like dog shaking in like a kennel? I mean, it's a trick, using that to make you feel sad to get something, but it's true. Like, but you have to do it ethically. And so like for me to write about pain, I have to also find the joy that beats it in a way. And I know there are people out there who unfortunately have had lives where that hasn't been their cards that they've been dealt, and that is an unfortunate thing. But that's why I believe in storytelling and why I feel like they always have to be told, regard like the multiplicity of them, why they need to exist. The more stories we have, the better we are, I think, as individuals. The more we listen to them and actually listen to them or read them. Um, but for me, that's how I do it. I think of Austin, and then I'm like, how do I not be like blank Alexi? Is like my go-to kind of way. And how do I not write about misery porn and cast these characters as tropes?
It's a good point. We talk a lot about, grief is another one that comes up. And really grief, is the kind of the flip side of love. Because if you haven't loved someone or something, you won't grieve their absence. And so sometimes you're right, finding the opposite, the complementary emotion that goes with it, because that's where the authenticity lies. Otherwise, you're right, you're just sort of making a little stylized version of pain, grief, death, suffering that doesn't ring so true. And I think we get it quickly when you read great literature, literary fiction or nonfiction that really portrays that versus the, characterization of, oh, here's pain, number 7 on the 1 to 10 scale. Doesn't have quite the same thing. So
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
will I will add that the dichotomy is actually really important. I left that out. That's something I think about and tell students all the time. I'm like, if like for symbols, I'm like, if you see a symbol building in this direction and it means happiness, you better go the other direction. It's like that counter somehow helps the story in a way, I think, achieve that perfect equilibrium or what we hope to be perfect.
I mean, and it's depth. I mean, I think all of us, like, we're as people, we all have so many different facets to ourselves, you know. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think the quote from Jane Austen is great. And I was thinking about Bobby. I mean, you bring humor into it, and you were there's there's this tremendous emotion, which I think, as readers we respond to, and we can tell when the emotion isn't really there, when it's not authentic. But then at the same time, we have like these great characters who, and he's a little bit of a comic relief, which I think we need, and it gives us kind of a break from that. Um, we had a couple of questions.
Yeah.
While you're finding the question, I just want to say, about Bobby, again, you could have the comic relief character feel like a stock character, but because he feels genuine, with his flaws and faults, and that he keeps tripping over his own best intentions, then he feels genuine. And I think he's very relatable. Even if I have nothing in common with this character, he just feels relatable because, someone who's caring and trying and yet just keeps tripping over his own inclinations feels so very human. I think lots of us have elements of that in our lives. And so it made it believable. And then I was able to, to laugh and not feel guilty because things were funny. There's genuine laughter and funniness even when things are painful. And when it feels genuine, then you're right, it feels like this multiplicity of stories.
Yeah, having that character, to make them not be a stock character is having them be, make sure they have a consequence like on the story, like they're influencing it in some way. Like that's like the best advice I always give people is it's like if you're gonna have that like dichotomy of a character, like they better play a good role, you know. And he's crying at the end, you know, and like, you know, so he, yeah, I love Bobby. I'm better at writing secondary characters for some reason, I feel like. I don't know.
Yeah, that's something someone said to me, which I always think about, is every secondary character believes that they are the main character. And I think that's definitely true for all of your secondary characters. They all, are real, they all want things for themselves and they're not stock characters in the background. So we had a couple of questions about the idea of epigenetic memory, knowing or remembering who your ancestors' story and the trauma without having experienced it. Um, what historical or legal context about blood quantum did you most wish readers brought to the novel, and what did you deliberately choose not to explain?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I chose, I don't think I even explained blood quantum in the book at all. Maybe like once, maybe, I'm not even sure. I know I mentioned the Esquire piece, which I'll put a link to, or I can actually send you the copy that isn't paywalled, if you want to share it. But I, in my mind, I was like, I'm not going to talk about blood quantum because like to talk about it would be to get caught up in the abstract of identity in a way. And as a fiction writer and nonfiction, and both of them, like you, like no ideas, but in things, as the saying goes, it's like you want to live in the concrete specificity, right? That's there and to talk about ideas of it and like things that we can't really grasp but shape us nonetheless was detracting. So I was like, I'm not going to explain it. I'm like, everybody's got a phone, they can Google it, um and but the Esquire piece came out I think 2 weeks before the book did, and so like that was to be kind of like, here is like some context a little bit for it, but obviously now it's paywall. But like, um, yeah, I for me, I chose not to explain because that's just too many marginalized voices have to explain information and or like things, and it takes away from the story in my opinion, unless it does actually add somehow. But like Hemingway never had to explain like his whiteness. You know what I mean? Like like I have an assignment that students have to do where, well, I basically say this. I'm like, I'm at like you go into a bookstore or something, and it's like you don't ever ask somebody like, "Where's your white people literature?" You know what I mean? Like when we think about categories, um, and so that is what's led to, I think, a categorization is it's like these books stand out because they're written by marginalized voices, but they stand out because they also tell us more about them. Or people expect to go to the book expecting, from native literature, to quote, Louis Owens, a scholar, like a comfortable, colorful tour of Indian country. I sat, I went to a community college first and then to Dartmouth College after, and I sat in a Native American literature class and we were asked why we were taking the class. And in an Ivy League institution, this guy goes, "Well, I really like arrowheads, so I thought I'd take this class." And it's like, okay, so there's this exotic.
There's your next secondary character. Like you just got to take notes on this stuff and use it.
I'll have but another version of Bobby like say something like that. But it like I was like, I can't. I have to just keep it to this, and hopefully a reader will trust me if they do the work because I feel like I did the work, or I hope I did the work, in making the book something if they met me halfway. But I did do a lot of research into it, so
Could I ask you a bit about the sense of place? Almost feels like a character. I mean, it's very vivid, geographically, culturally, um, and how active in your mind is it as you're writing, or it just sort of seeps in and of itself?
it's always there. It for me, I mean, place, I mean, in like in Western like culture, isn't place is a thing meant to be, extracted from. It's, we think about the Marshall Trilogy, it's called, in 1823, these ruling of court cases in which the Supreme Court ruled that tribes do not have a right to own the land, they have a right of occupancy. That's what they ruled essentially. So a right of occupancy. But indigenous people had a different philosophy about land, and it's embedded in language deeply. Um, in English, we say, like, I am from Bangor, right? Like, look at that on the page or even hear it, and it's like separated. In Penobscot, for example, to say Penobscot, it's Punawupskek. And that means it translates roughly to like where the water descends upon the rocky place. Punawupskek, if you get rid of the EK at the end and you add a WI to it, it's one word, Punawupskewi, that denotes a person who is from that place. But see how it's like inseparable? Like the suffix, belongs to it. So so it's literally like you are part of that place. Like you come from that place. I mean, our creation story, one of them is that like Kiji Nuesque, who is the great being, created Gluskabe, who was tasked with creating people, and one of them was he shot an arrow into an ash tree, and out of that ash tree sprung, us. So like we came from the land, right? And we see this in indigenous stories, not just in the US, but across the world, right? How about place being literally part and inseparable of how you live and talk. The Sioux language has the word ni that means both self and land, depending on the context. Um, and so for me, I can't help but think of place culturally in my own mind as like inseparable. Um, I'm reminded now, my mom's gone, but I'm reminded now for constantly always picking trash up, and tending to that stuff. But like, but also in a craft way, it's like, I have not done drugs, but this is gonna sound like I did drugs. I always tell people or I ask people, I'm like, does story predate human existence? Like, if you can be this omniscient, and I'm not talking about reconciling life and stuff, but like I always say to people, I'm like, if we just were an omniscient observer of Earth with no humans on it, is story still present? It's not a Michael Bay film, right? But like a beaver, chops a tree down and like there falls like maybe a new nest like a bird made and its eggs break, like there's action, there's consequence occurring. And then how does the quote go? Unfortunately, we came along or something like that. And then like we found it, we stumbled into it. So place was there before us. It became this foundation from which I think craft originated from, you know. I don't know if that answers your question. I just felt like I had to say all of that.
Yeah,
Uh,
but I think part of it, though, also going back to craft, you talked about specificity.
yeah.
And again, a story, the same, woman goes on a journey of her quest is very different in a different place and, of course, in a different time. And that's what makes, such a difference in these different stories. The class is only two or three basic stories, but because they're set in different places and times and people, they all feel quite unique. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, specificity is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I knew the contours of this reservation. I mean, I knew like the river and the sort of the rocks, the cemetery, because it was so, it was so present. But I was just thinking about what you were saying. I mean, just the idea of, the place pre-existing humans and story pre-existing humans. And so it's such a different way of thinking about it. And it's a way of really not centering, you know, ourselves, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that takes helps in my mind helps me get the ego, away from it a little bit because
Mm.
it's like I've always thought of it as like once something is in front of an editor or I share it with a reader, like it's no longer mine anymore. Like it becomes a thing that we work on to see how well we can get it, right? And if it fails, it fails. But even in its failure, it still is like you know, I say this, I'm like, writing a story is like each page you write is like an odometer clicking on a car you're driving towards the city, like where the story takes place. And like you need to write those pages that go nowhere, right? That are not the destination or the location. Like you need to write those to get to the story. Like I had to write like 2,000 pages just to get to this book, like, and it's hard. It's hard work. And, but I feel all of us are storytellers. Like we are. We all come from a lineage of storytellers. Like you might not believe that, but like, or you might not know it. It might not be a story you know about yourself, right? But like we are storytellers. Like that is how
Right.
we have made our life. That's how we've built the world, is through story.
Well, and what's fascinating, think about healthcare and medicine. I mean, what is that if not stories? I mean, patients are coming. I was in clinic today, and every 20 minutes opens a new story. The door opens, and there's a new story with different characters and plot and challenge. And from that, we have to try and make a diagnosis. But if you don't understand the story, you can't get anywhere because patients don't come in with a disease, on a placard hanging from their neck. They come in with their metaphor of what they're feeling, and we have to interpret that metaphor and understand the story. We had a couple of questions that were submitted in advance that I wanted to share one or two of them. Someone asked, what was the most challenging aspect of writing this story, and how did you overcome it?
I think one was, well, no, I got quite a good amount of joy out of the fact that that an indigenous person wrote a book from the first person of a non-native. Like I did get a lot of joy out of that, but I did worry about like how indigenous people might view it. Like why write, this was a question that was posed earlier, like why write from the perspective of this outsider? Um, because I can't quite really think of any indigenous literature that does something like that. There might be a few, but mostly it's indigenous people or people who are not like enrolled, right? Um, but I don't know. I like the hardest part I think was letting it out into the world and being prepared to talk about the types of things we're talking about now and still being unsure. Like I said earlier, like I read lines from this and I'm like, I don't agree with that now, but like at the time I might have, in some way.
Right.
Like the book challenges me, like it still does. Like I don't read it like every night, It's not like that's what I do, but like I was afraid of how the book would. I was afraid the book would do no good. You know what I mean? Like I think that's the biggest fear, and not success, money and stuff like that. Like that's not what it's about for me. I mean, it is not. Um, I was afraid the book would just not, that people wouldn't find it, and it wouldn't offer them something that they could use in their real life. That was my biggest like worry, my biggest fear.
So hopefully you overcame it by seeing the response and reaction.
I have, yes.
All
Yeah,
right.
no, it's a great response. Yeah, you're talking about how you feel so differently now after from the things you wrote initially. I mean, it reminds me of something I've heard where it takes so long to write a book, to write a novel. Then, I mean, you change as a person because it's just, people keep growing and changing. So of course you have to be a different person by the end of it, and which I think is so interesting about just the process of writing. Um, there's a couple more questions. Do people want to ask on camera, or should we just
I
read the
mean, if you'd
question?
like to unmute, um, I know, Irene, you had a question there. If you would like to unmute, you're welcome to. But
Oh,
if you don't,
okay.
we're happy to read it. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sure. I'll read it out loud. Thank you. Because we experience the story through Charles, we are often inside his explanations for his choices. What did you want readers to recognize about him that he may never fully recognize about himself?
I'm still trying to actually figure out the answer to that question, to be fair. But I do have an answer, not to just hide away from that. But I feel like Charles, like, for those of you who've read the book, I don't want to spoil anything. Like, like Charles sets out with what he wants to do. The question is, does he ever actually achieve or do the thing that he does, And for Charles, in thinking about like what did I want readers to recognize about him that he may never fully recognize about himself, I don't think that he understand like he articulates these things about like like you need to know your stories to know like who you are and stuff. But I don't think he actually understands it in a way. Like so he's as unwell as Elizabeth is. And I also think he's unwilling to a degree, I think, to accept the things he says. You know what I mean? He's almost like a politician, but like he won't like I don't think there's a difference between understanding and knowing. Like he knows to say these things as like wisdom or something, but I don't really know if he believes them. Like I don't know, like not in a bad and ill-intentioned way, because he's not I mean, is he better by the end of the book? Like is he like like that's what I'm always left wondering. Like, is he? I mean, like Bobby's over there crying, and but he and his daughter, sure, there's the moment there, but I'm like, did he change at all? Like, is he? Did any like he did all this explaining, he did all this narrating, he orchestrated the story, right? Like he directed us, but did he do anything for himself? You know what I mean? Like, did he take back any part of his life? Maybe at times, I'm not sure.
But I think
I'm
the ambiguity adds to the enjoyment of the story that you can walk away without it being handed to you on a platter and walk away and keep thinking about it after you close the book. That's what you want your readers to do.
Yeah, this question sits with me all the time. I'm not joking. In various ways, like phrased differently. And I really appreciate you, Irene, for asking that. Thank you.
Oh, definitely. I just want to say, as an Indigenous reader, I love that you wrote about a non-Indigenous character from your perspective. Like, and I think that this character is so complicated because this is not usually a story we hear worked through.
No, yeah, it's not one. And like I really I'm gonna have to Google after like if there like what other books out there by Indigenous authors that use wholly just like a non-native narrator. Even if it's somebody who hasn't grown up in that setting, because you're right, it's always native character, it's always native characters because of publishing, wanting and demanding that it exhaust that's what sells, Um, yeah.
There is a book written about the MMIW experience, but it's a dual perspective. A Native woman who's investigating a serial killer who is not Native. So that's like the first one that comes to mind. I can like send out the name of that book. I'm still reading it.
Yeah, I'd love the name of it actually. Yeah.
Yeah, you can post that in the chat. Thank you, Irene. Hopefully we got
Yes.
your name correct this time. Appreciate that. There was one more question that was submitted earlier asking, were there sections of the book that brought about unexpected self-discoveries for you as the writer?
No, no, I'm just kidding. Probably, it is a bit of a blur just because I had written the book and my editor, went to work on it, and then when I got it back, I had my son, and I remember being in like, he was a baby, and I didn't sleep, and I was, having to go through all these pages and doing all these edits, and I remember rewriting actually a portion, um, and I think, wait, what was it? Anything that changed me? Yeah,
Yeah, any self-discovery that you came in. Obviously, you grow. By the time the book comes out from when you started, you've
yeah,
probably grown, a fifth of your life has gone by.
yeah. Okay. So one of the things is the big thing, and this is like the real life what you've experienced. Like my first book, there are so many things I can point to, be like that happened in real life, that happened in real life, that happened in real life. Like that's pretty much nonfiction, up until this degree. But this book was purely like like I didn't really grab at anything, except for the abstract feelings I had, and held and used. But I was revising. There's a moment when uh, Charles finds his mother later on in the book. And I found myself revising that moment, and it matched the exact way I discovered my own mother's passing. And so the real life of grief, regardless of a writer's role to sit down and, separate yourselves at times from fiction, and to like get into the minds of the characters, like that's not always true. Like you can let in the real life stuff. It's just a matter of how do you pattern it in a way that comes across as fiction, right? Versus nonfiction. And so I believed that I could write a piece or I wanted to write something that like didn't touch anything in my life, like real like stories and stuff, like throwing in actual things and changing names or something. But I couldn't. And like that moment that I had to draw from real life, the real grief, right? And it was the only time I actually cried when drafting the book, because everything else was work. Is the only time that I cried, like in working on it because it was grief that I was processing in the moment of something, like greater, but also something so small. Um, so yeah, the personal or the subjective and the objective, they like to dance. Yeah.
Yeah, fiction we always talk about is the great lies that tell the truth.
Yeah.
You make it up, but of course the sensations, the feelings, the emotions, those are real. Even if the
They are.
characters are invented.
Right. And I think as a reader, you can tell when there is that genuine emotion on the page. And yeah, I mean, I go through that too as a writer. When there's something very emotional, you feel it as you write it. It is a way, it's just a way of kind of moving through that feeling. Um,
We have
Ellen,
time for one more question from the chat.
Ellen, you had a question about Indigenous writers that Morgan admired. Do you want to ask directly or?
Sure. Um, I was just curious about other Indigenous writers and, who's on your bookshelf? Who do you admire? Which other Indigenous writers would you recommend that we
Yeah.
read?
All right. Now I got to go over to my bookshelf. Can y'all still hear me?
All right, show and tell. Yeah.
All right. Louise Erdrich,
Yes.
uh, Tommy Orange,
Yeah.
Ed Scott Momaday, James Welch. What else do we have here? I like how Dennis Johnson is in this section for some reason, but he's not native. But um, there's an anthology called Never Whistle at Night, which is a collection of stories by Indigenous writers, and it's edited by Shane Hawk and Theodore Van Alst Jr. Highly recommend it. Stephen Graham Jones, horror writer, but literary as well. Um, my God, he's not native, but Peter Mathiassen's In the Spirit of Crazy Horse is a great book. And all of this is like federal Indian law, which I love to read about. Tony Jensen, Linda Hogan, Richard Van Camp, The Lesser Blessed. Read that book. My God, he's from for his first name. He's Dogrib First Nation. Um, David Troyer's work. I could keep going. Bohan Lewis, Natalie Diaz. I mean, I mean, so many of them.
Well, maybe you'll send us a list and we'll send out to our newsletter, from Morgan's bookshelf.
I can take
Here
a
are some
picture. Yeah,
recommendations. Take a picture because everyone's looking for summer reads and we'd love to share the books that inspired you.
yeah, and I will also say, like this is not a writer. I, I do admire aspects of his work, but blank Alexi, and I want to just throw that name out there, that individual, who is canceled now, but whose work, like, if you're an Indigenous writer, and even if you're not an Indigenous writer, like, even if you're just a reader, like, reading it and looking at it and comparing it against other forms of literature, I think is an important thing to do. Maybe not, maybe don't buy the books, I don't know. I don't know how all this works. he's up here next to Claire Dederer's book Monsters, along with other writers I've been trying to write an essay about. But like, I do admire some of the stuff that he's done, but on the other hand, I don't. Um, but yeah, I have a lot of writers I admire, and a lot of writers I'm kind of like, you know.
Um,
You're like, send me the list of the people you don't like.
Well, we were at the top of the hour. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and ending with a great list of recommendations is a fabulous way because, what is a book club but people sharing reading? And I encourage people to check out, if you haven't read Fire Exit, that is really a great book. And if you're just starting it now, log on to our Facebook group and check out Doris W. Cheng's beautiful, interesting commentaries, thoughtful. You can comment at any point. Never goes out of style, never goes out of date. Doris, any final thoughts?
No, thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you, Morgan. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. It was really great to just read together. So hope we'll do it again
Yeah,
soon.
right.
Thank you.
And if you're not in the BLR mailing list, you'll be hearing from us. We have events coming up in the fall, and we hope you'll come. And thank you so much for joining our community tonight. Have a great night.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Take care.